A warm welcome to the world today. I'm Joke Rogers. Here's what's coming up within the hour. Russia is cautiously optimistic over U.S.-backed ceasefire deal in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin says there's still more work to do. Meanwhile, Ukraine reacts to President Putin's response, calling it manipulative. Plus, more calls for increase in NATO defense spending as Poland marks 26th membership anniversary. Let's begin the world today. Russian President Vladimir Putin has become a bit wary of the ceasefire deal brokered by the United States and Ukraine officials following their talks in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday. On Thursday, the Russian government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said there's a lot ahead to be done and that the president still needs answers even after he raised several questions about how the truce would work. President Putin has asked whether Ukraine would use the 30-day ceasefire to mobilize, rearm or train people, particularly in light of the situation in Kursk. He then questioned who would police the ceasefire and determine whether anyone breaks it. While Ukraine wants 2 stages to the ceasefire, one pending negotiations for a longer-term settlement, Russia thinks all should be decided in one deal. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has reacted to President Putin's questions and probe into the ceasefire deal being proposed this week, condemning the Russian president for the ambivalent response. In his nightly address on Thursday, he said, "We now have all heard Mr. Putin's very predictable, very manipulative words in response to the idea of a ceasefire." He accused Putin of actually preparing a refusal, but claimed he was afraid to say directly to President Trump that he wants to continue this war. He also said Mr. Putin was framing the idea of a ceasefire with such preconditions that nothing will work out at all or for as long as possible. Washington has called for Russia to accept the deal without preconditions, but Mr. Putin has gone ahead to list a number of obstacles in the way. Meanwhile, all G7 leaders say they agree with the U.S. proposal for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Ukraine also says it has begun to form a team to monitor any possible ceasefire. And while Russia insists it's continuing to retake parts of its Kursk region, which Ukraine invaded last year, the Ukrainian Air Force says Russia launched 27 drones towards the country overnight, with air defense systems successfully shooting down 16. According to the Air Force, 9 of those drones did not reach their target and have since been located with no negative consequences. Kharkiv and Donetsk were both affected. Separately, Russia has reported overnight attacks, with the governor of the Krasnodar region in the south confirming that the Tuapse oil complex was hit. He says a gasoline tank caught fire, and as of the early hours of the morning, emergency agencies, including 121 personnel, were working to fight the blaze. Right now, let's take a look at, expand more on this discussion about the war in Ukraine. And we're being joined by writer and journalist Natalia Gumanyuk. She joins us from Kyiv. Natalia, great to have you on the show today.
Good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Right, so do you think the U.S. brokered ceasefire deal for Ukraine is strong enough to provide some relief in this war?
So we had the negotiations with Russia since 2015 till 2022 for 7 years, where there were hundreds of cases of ceasefire. None of them ever hold. So for Ukraine, this is like the start of the process when we expect for the next year there would be a lot of these type of events. So there would be one, and maybe there would be a dozen of this type of occasions when we will return to these discussions. But it's really not something which is extremely significant. It doesn't really influence everyday life or the ceasefire. It might hold for a week, it might not hold, it might not be enforced. Because what is also important, yes, there is ambiguity of what the Russian President Putin said, because the whole idea of the ceasefire to make it unconditional, because as long as you start to discuss the details, then it's kind of lasting for, it can last forever. But Vladimir Putin said, yes, but there should be conditions. So unconditional ceasefire is not accepted, so probably for the next couple of weeks there would be some discussions, and the question would there be the profound discussion, or there would be just this process to engage the US in the communication. So and that's what we're expecting. But even though, you know, people here don't think that something would hold more than, you know, a week, so it's not really something which will stop the course of the war. And also now is a particular moment, so Russians of course are interested in a bit prolonging that. So they want to kind of overtake the Kursk region and put a lot of effort in if you speak about the military force, to regain the territory back and use all their capabilities they were unable to use for the last half a year.
Right, and this is a deal Russia says is good, but President Putin alludes that there have to be, you know, conditions. The ceasefire must lead to lasting peace, he says. What do you make of the Russian response to the ceasefire deal?
So the Russian conditions have never changed since the ultimatum Vladimir Putin issued like 3 years ago. Technically, it's like Ukraine shouldn't exist, or Ukraine shouldn't have the army, and Ukraine shouldn't be able to defend itself, which is, of course, no go for Ukraine, because, first of all, Ukraine has the right to exist. I don't think we need to discuss it, and Ukraine has the right to have the army to defend itself. So these are the initial conditions of Russia, you know. So, the Vladimir Putin is known for being quite easy, like expressing the same things for years, or being very vague about that. That's what we make. That, you know, the question is like whether he would play along the American game to kind of be engaged for a couple of weeks, or he'll refuse, you know, in a few days, and it would be more clear.
And do you think Russia really wants an end to this war?
There is no any sign that Russia wants to end this war. There was no sign for the last 3 years. And I think we in Ukraine, we are able to read Russian. We are able to watch the Russian government media. And, you know, the tone hasn't changed. They really still go on speaking that, you know, Ukraine should be dissolved as a state. It has no right to exist. What was interesting that for the last couple of weeks, they were pretty celebratory that, you know, like, oh, finally the US is pushing Ukraine, so we'll be able to, you know, gain the victory here. But the Russian really has developed their military industry complex. They are interested in prolonging the war, and there is no sign why they should really stop it. Mainly not because it's easy. The Russian economy is in a bad shape. In the long run, they pay a huge amount of money for their soldiers to, you know, to fight. Speaking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. But in the end, they are under the feeling that if the West would, you know, undermine support to Ukraine, maybe this year would be very important for them to finally to gain the victory. So that's how we read the situation.
And do you think the U.S.-Russia relations are already under any kind of threat as a result of the peace talk that held in Jeddah this week and the agreement that followed? It was initially thought that President Trump was trying to revive relations with Moscow with the first round of talks that held in Saudi Arabia.
So indeed, from Ukraine, how it's seen that indeed the whole discussion in Jeddah between the Americans and the Russians is not about the, you know, settling the war, the Russian war against Ukraine and ending it. It's really about the reset of the American-Russian relations. There are a lot of speculations whether the Washington wants to separate Moscow from Beijing, what is their idea, but it's indeed they're looking forward into, you know, changing the status quo, because of course Russia Russia was kind of a pariah state. There are a lot of sanctions. Vladimir Putin there is a International Criminal Court warrant issued against Vladimir Putin. He couldn't travel internationally. The world leaders of Europe were not meeting him. So it's really reset. It's kind of a legitimization of Russia. So I think that, yes, the relations between Russia and the US has already changed. The US has legitimized Vladimir Putin, and they would try to kind of find the common ground. It's a question whether it would work in the long run, but I assume for a couple of months we would observe this kind of growing cooperation and discussions between two countries.
And until the ceasefire holds, civilians and infrastructure, critical infrastructure, have continued to bear the brunt of this war. We've seen in the past week, there have been reports, or, there were overnight drone strikes on Ukraine in the past week. There have also been reports of attacks on Ukraine energy infrastructure. These are enough to eradicate any sign of goodwill to any future deals. You advise Ukraine continues on this path to peace with Russia despite this?
So, look, important to understand that the drone attacks against Ukrainian cities, including the cities far from frontline like Kiev or a lot of other cities, are happening on the daily basis for the last kind of over a year and a half. It's always depending on the scale. Drones are okay, but it could be the supersonic, ballistic missiles. So there are kind of over months, usually two incredibly big attacks and a daily attacks. Ukraine is capable to stop the drone attacks. If you really speak about supersonic and ballistic weapon, it's really about the air defense, including whether Ukraine has enough of shells to defend itself, which depend on the American support. And I'm speaking about the civilians and protection of the civilians' life in the cities far away from the front line. So we haven't seen these goodwill gestures. If you really even have an important meetings like the meetings in Jeddah, meeting in the Oval Office, or like Munich Security Conference. During these days, in particular, Russia is like targeting the Chernobyl nuclear power station, or some major attacks are happening. So they are there. But I don't think Ukraine is really relying that there would be the goodwill gesture or something. It's literally whether the Russia would, really say we stop it, whether they would admit that, or we would, for the next months, would observe this type of the, like meddling, engaging the world into the technical discussions where we don't understand what is happening, and the Americans also won't understand whether there is a ceasefire, whether Russians are ready. So I think I would rather say that's what we observe, but we don't expect any goodwill gesture or stop of the attacks on the infrastructure on the daily basis, which is happening. They are usually stopped just with air defense.
And NATO membership is, what began all of this in the first place. The US has made it clear that that is off the table for Ukraine now, which means even when the war ends, it may never be brought up again. Is it fair that this still exists while Ukraine is obligated to uphold the treaty on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons?
So first of all, the NATO was never at heart of that. It's a bit of the discussion which is kind of brought because for the Russians, the most important is Ukraine, which is not able to protect itself and which exists under Russian political umbrella. That is the most important thing. The NATO technically is the only real guarantee. If you really start to invent any other, type of the security guarantees for Ukraine, that Ukraine won't be attacked after lasting ceasefire, it's like inventing the wheel. But of course, for Ukraine, it's not really about these four letters. Also because NATO didn't show itself being stronger. And by the way, we know that in the end, Finland and Sweden joined the NATO, so kind of Putin brought on themselves even, NATO enlargement, but on the north of Europe. Yet, I think it's not totally out of the table, but it's really about the security guarantee. And now there is a different question. What is NATO? Should we have a different European umbrella? Because what is the role of the US in NATO? So I think the discussion is really there, but what is clear that Ukraine should be a part of the European security architecture in case the United States are not longer, protecting Europe as it used to be for the last 70 years.
And President Trump has agreed to reinstate military aid for Ukraine. With all that has happened under the Trump administration so far, would you still consider the U.S. an ally of Ukraine?
I think it's very important for the Ukrainians to understand that, of course, yes, Ukrainian civilian lives depends, as I said, about the air defense from the American air defense. But of course, it was a very vulnerable moment, and I think the U.S. Trustworthiness has been, challenged, and a lot of countries globally stopped to trust U.S. as its military partner. But Ukraine also feel like we shouldn't push U.S. too much into the Russian hands. I think in the long run, I don't believe that the Russian-American cooperation would work after a year. And in the end, there is something normal about remaining in the good relations. Europeans want to maintain good relations with the U.S. We definitely don't want to have the United States on the other side. And I think like nobody, the Europeans, the Africans, Latin Americans, nobody really want to have the U.S. as their adversary. So it's really very unpredictable administration. There is a question whether you can trust, but there would be probably more transactional relations between the countries with their drawbacks. But for us, it's very important to protect civilian lives. And so far, unless Americans can help with it, Ukrainians would work on that.
Right, Natalia, thank you so much for your time today. A pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
More from the U.S. president, who has defended his comments about not protecting allies who wouldn't pay into NATO. He was making the remark in the Oval Office, where he was hosting NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on Thursday. Mr. Trump had famously said that he has warned allies that he would encourage Russia to do whatever they wanted to countries that did not pay their share.
First meeting, I noticed that very few people were paying, and if they were, they weren't paying their fair share. There were only 7 countries that were paying what they were supposed to be paying, which was, yeah,
it's even worse.
Could be even worse. But there were just very few countries that were paying, and even the paying, it was at 2%, which is too low. It should be higher. It should be quite a bit higher. But you had Poland, and I remember Poland was actually paying a little bit more than they were supposed to, which I was very impressed with. They've been actually terrific, and some of the others. But most of them weren't paying, or they were paying very little. And I didn't think it was appropriate to bring it up there, but I said it's going to be brought up at my next meeting. And my next meeting, the first meeting, you want to give them a little break. The second meeting, it began, and I was able to raise hundreds of billions of dollars. I just said, we're not going to be involved with you if you're not going to pay. And the money started pouring in, and NATO became much stronger because of my actions and working along with a lot of people, including Mark. But they would not pay for other presidents, and I don't think other presidents even knew that they weren't paid. I asked, first question, has everybody paid up? And literally, I mean, they told me 7. You could be right, it could be 3, but that makes it even worse. But they just weren't paying. And I said, no, I won't protect if you're not paying. If you're delinquent, or if the money isn't paid, why would we do that? And as soon as I said that, you get a little hit from the press, because they said, oh, gee, that's not very nice. But if you said the other, nobody would have paid. And the money started coming in by the billions. And, hundreds of billions of dollars flowed into NATO, and NATO became strong.
Well, Polish President Andrzej Duda has called on NATO allies to increase their defense budgets and strive for a robust transatlantic bond. His comments come as Poland marked its 26th anniversary since joining the bloc. Mr. Duda, in his speech to the nation, reflected on his initial proposal at last year's NATO forum to allocate 3% of the country's GDP to defense spending. He emphasized that the urgency of this measure has become absolutely evident.
On March the 12th, 1999, Poland became part of NATO. Today, we celebrate the 26th anniversary of that event. Exactly 1 year ago in Washington, D.C., I was the first NATO leader to present a proposal that all members of the alliance should increase their defense spending to a minimum level of 3% of their GDP. I presented it also at the NATO forum. Back then, many voices were saying that a number of states were not ready to adopt such solution. Today, its necessity is absolutely evident. In Europe and across the alliance, a serious discussion is going on about the rapid increase in defense expenditures. This is the right direction. We must spend more, enhance our military potential and deterrence capabilities. Today, NATO must be bold and resolute in its actions. Therefore, a few days ago, I submitted an official request to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte that increasing defense spending to a minimum of 3% of GDP by all NATO members be raised at the upcoming summit in The Hague. We no longer have time for discussions. We need decisions. We must act now.
In the meantime, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko have signed a number of joint documents following their talks in Moscow on Thursday. The two leaders exchanged letters of ratification of the Treaty on Security Guarantees within the Union State of Russia and Belarus, as well as protocols on amendments to the 1998 treaty between Minsk and Moscow on equal rights of citizens, on measures for mutual protection of citizens from unjustified prosecution by foreign states and international justice bodies. The presidents also signed a joint statement of the presidents and a number of other documents. According to the Kremlin's press service, Mr. Putin and Mr. Lukashenko confirmed the allied nature of relations between Russia and Belarus and the unchanged course on expanding strategic partnership in all spheres in order to fully strengthen bilateral cooperation and further deepen integration processes based on the principles of sovereign equality, consideration of each other's interests, and good faith fulfillment of mutual obligations. Elsewhere, high-ranking diplomats from China, Russia and Iran are gathered in Beijing to discuss Tehran's nuclear issues amid pushes from U.S. President Donald Trump to make a deal with the Middle Eastern country on its nuclear program. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov and Iranian counterpart Kazem Garibadian arrived at the meeting venue where they were hosted by Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Ma Jiazhu. A post-meeting joint statement later read that Beijing and Moscow demanded full respect to Iran's nuclear program, which was claimed to be for peaceful purposes. The two countries also called for the lift of sanctions on Tehran and mutual respect for dialogue to recommence. Iran reached the landmark Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with several global powers, including the U.S. in 2015, to restrict its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Mr. Trump, however, pulled out of the pact in 2018 during his first term, while Tehran was accused of ignoring its commitments following Washington's withdrawal. Same with issues relating to the United States, President Donald Trump says he's not going to bend on auto and metal tariffs coming from Canada. He told reporters at the White House on Thursday that he's not going to change his mind on the tariffs he's imposing, claiming that the U.S. has been ripped off for years.
We've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore. No, I'm not going to bend at all. Aluminum or steel or cars, we're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to. In the case of Canada, we're spending $200 billion a year to subsidize Canada. I love Canada. I love the people of Canada. I have many friends in Canada. The great one, Wayne Gretzky, the great. Hey, how good is Wayne Gretzky? He's the great one. But we have, I know many people from Canada that are good friends of mine. But, you know, the United States can't subsidize a country for $200 billion a year. We don't need their cars. We don't need their energy. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give. We do it because we want to be helpful. But it comes a point when you just can't do that. You have to run your own country. And to be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have. As a state, it would be one of the great states anyway. This would be the most incredible country visually. If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S., just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago, and makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state.
Well, with this stance, it seems the U.S. president is moving his country close to an all-out trade war with longtime allies, threatening tariffs on goods not only from China but also from Canada, as you've heard him there, as well as Mexico and the European Union. But those former partners aren't just rolling over. There have been protests and counter-tariffs and even consumers boycotting American brands. Lars Holt is with Deutsche Welle and joins me from Berlin. Lars, great to see you. Are you seeing consumers react to this new environment?
Thanks for having me. Yes, I do in fact see that, not just in stores, but there are also protests and boycott communities that are sharing experiences online, including photos. And there's a lot of grocery stores that have emptied out their shelves with American specialties, in some cases replacing them with Turkish or other ethnic foods. And there's a new survey out that says that indeed almost 2/3 of Germans are currently trying to avoid U.S. products. Now, that's a lot of brands, because globalization and consolidation over decades have, of course, led to a situation where some brands are very dominant in certain sectors. In food and beverage, for example, there's Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. There's also Mondelez with brands ranging from Heinz to Kraft. And then, of course, there's Procter & Gamble in consumer goods with their shampoos and soaps and detergent. Now, many of these products will likely sell a bit less, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how long consumers will actually stay the course. Usually these boycotts are pretty short-lived because consumers tend to come back to the brands that they've known and trusted for a long time. For U.S. companies, it might be a lot worse. In Canada, there are, of course, entire grocery chains are boycotting American brands, taking their shelf off the product. But in Germany and the EU, we'll have to see how much damage this whole thing actually does.
And that's reactions from consumers. What about the companies? Are they worried?
That's simple. They're imposing tariffs too. Trump has put tariffs on steel and aluminium imports, and he's been threatening the EU with tariffs on cars, of course, which set to go into effect in about 2 weeks. Now, the EU has put a 50% tariff on Harley-Davidson motorcycles. There's also tariffs on 50% on whiskey. Now, whiskey and those motorcycles are mostly made in Republican states. So are soybeans, by the way, that are now also tariffed. So Brussels is, as they've done before, making a political statement. They are going after imports from states where Republicans will feel the pain. Now, the EU is still somewhat hesitant to be more aggressive. They have repeatedly said that they don't want a trade war. But with Mr. Trump in the White House, there's, of course, not much reasoning. He has already threatened now tariffs of 200% on French wine and champagne. That was as of last night. And he has often said the EU was formed, and I quote, to screw America, which is obviously nonsense, but he seems to see it that way, and he wants revenge. The EU, in either case, is prepared for an escalation. Brussels is now saying that they could even use an anti-coercion tool that would allow them to put tariffs on service companies. And that could mean that technology firms like Google, for example, would also be impacted. And now that could really hurt the US.
Right, that's reactions on how the EU is countering Mr. Trump's trade tariffs. Thank you so much for your time again. Let's move on. Chinese Consul General to Nigeria, Ms. Yang Yuqing, has been reiterating Foreign Minister Wang Yi's address on China's foreign policy at the end of the 2 session meetings in Beijing. The 2 sessions in the collective term for the annual plenary sessions of the People's Republic of China, while highlighting the importance of the One China policy, development of AI technology and sustained economic development. He also addressed the issue of trade tariffs with the United States, stating that China will stand on the right side of history and human progress, which will provide certainty in an uncertain world. According to the Consul General, Mr. Yang emphasizes that China-U.S. relations must be one of mutual respect and that China remains ready for any surprises.
We are living in a challenging and turbulent world where certainty is becoming a scarce resource. The choices made by countries, especially major countries, will determine the trajectory of our times and shape the future of the world. China's diplomacy will stand firm on the right side of history and on the side of human progress. We will provide certainty to this uncertain world. We will be a strong force defending our national interests. We will be a just and righteous forces for world peace and stability. We will be a progressive force for international fairness and justice. We will be a constructive force for common development of the world.
The European Union sees South Africa not just as a partner but as a strategic ally, united by shared values of democracy, human rights and multilateralism. This was the message from European Council President Antonio Costa at the recently concluded South Africa-EU summit in Cape Town. Mr. Costa, alongside European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, met with President Cyril Ramaphosa to reinforce diplomatic and economic ties. Meanwhile, European Commission President Dr. Ursula von der Leyen also assured South Africa of the EU's full support as it prepares to take on the G20 presidency and host the upcoming EU-Africa summit later this year. Our South Africa correspondent Innocent Samusa has more.
This summit comes at a crucial time as both sides seek to strengthen strategic ties in the face of rising global challenges. Now, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is co-chairing the meeting alongside EU leaders, making a key moment in diplomatic relations between South Africa and the European Union. Now, the discussion, we do know that it will cover trade, security, and of course, cooperation, among others. The summit comes just weeks after the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, and several European nations backed South Africa in its role as the current G20 president. This follows a diplomatic snap by US State and Treasury secretaries who skipped key G20 meetings.
Today's summit focused on a number of issues that were covered and discussed during our summit. And they focus on strengthening our trade and investment relations, which are vital for the growth of our economies.
European Council President Antonio Costa highlights that the EU and South Africa are more than just partners, they are strategic allies.
And this summit has demonstrated that our partnership is not only strategic, but also essential. And we are fully committed to work together to strengthen our multilateral institutions by reforming them in the way to be more representative and also to reform our the international financial institutions.
So, President Ramaphosa, dear Cyril, as Antonio already said, we are 100% behind you in making South Africa's G20 presidency a big success. This is going to be the first G20 summit ever held on the African continent. I think it's a powerful symbol.
Some members of parliament have expressed confidence in the outcomes of this summit.
I really believe that our relations with the EU and South Africa are very important, and so we welcome today's discussions that are taking place at an executive level. It's very important for us to establish that, given the fact that EU is one of our most important trade partners, and given the fact as well that there is global tension when it comes to trade agreements
from the perspective of the ACDP, we say to the developing and the developed countries that we too have to do what is good for South Africa.
As the European delegation and the South African government meet here in Parliament, members of Parliament here in South Africa have welcomed this meeting. They say that they can only hope that this meeting here, whatever that has been resolved, it will be indeed be translated into tangible actions. From Cape Town, South Africa, Innocent Samosa, Channels Television News.
UN experts have accused Israel of increasingly using sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians in carrying out genocidal acts through the systematic destruction of maternal and reproductive health care facilities. A report commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council documents alleged violations, including rape in Gaza and the occupied West Bank since Hamas' 7 October 2023 attack on Israel triggered the Gaza war. However, Israel has said it categorically rejects the unfounded allegations. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded angrily, calling the Human Rights Council an anti-Semitic, rotten, terrorist-supporting and irrelevant body. The report also says the destruction of maternity wards in Gaza and embryos at the fertility clinic could indicate a strategy to prevent births among a particular group, one of the legal definitions of genocide.
This morning we published a report titled More Than a Human Can Bear, dealing with Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence since 7 October 2023. Our report finds that Israel has increasingly employed sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence against Palestinians as part of a broader effort to undermine their right to self-determination. It also concludes that Israel has carried out genocidal acts through the systematic destruction of sexual and reproductive healthcare facilities. It is the first in-depth UN investigation into sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence by the Israeli security forces and Israeli settlers since October 2023. The frequency, prevalence and severity of sexual and gender-based crimes perpetrated across the occupied Palestinian territory leads the Commission to conclude that sexual and gender-based violence is increasingly used as a method of war by Israel to destabilize, dominate, oppress and destroy the Palestinian people. The Commission documented a pattern of sexual violence, including cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence, torture and other inhumane acts that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was quite surprised to see that response. Netanyahu has said that Israel will not participate in the Council or any of its processes. So I'm worried that the Israeli mission here may be disciplined for breaching that order of the Prime Minister of Israel. So, yeah, a bit surprised. Look, the bottom line is, as usual, it's all lies.
Well, the United States and Israel have held discussions with 3 East African governments about the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza to Sudan, Somalia and its breakaway region of Somaliland. This is according to U.S. and Israeli officials quoted by U.S. media. Friday's report said officials from Sudan claimed to have rejected overtures from the U.S., while officials from Somalia and Somaliland say they are unaware of the contacts. Speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss a secret diplomatic initiative, U.S. and Israeli officials confirmed the contacts with Somalia and Somaliland, while the U.S. officials confirmed Sudan as well. They said it was unclear how much progress the efforts made or at what level the discussions took place. The development comes more than a month after U.S. President Donald Trump floated the idea of forcibly displacing Palestinians and taking over the Gaza Strip. It was roundly rejected by Palestinians and countries in the Middle East, with many describing it as ethnic cleansing. Well, right now, an estimated 12.1 million women and girls, and increasingly men and boys, are at risk of sexual violence in Sudan, and this is an 80% increase from the previous year. This is according to Catherine Russell, Executive Director of UNICEF, briefing the UN Security Council on the situation in the country.
of Sudan's total population, with its economy and social services system and infrastructure in near collapse and no end to the conflict in sight, we estimate that nearly 2/3 of Sudan's total population, more than 30 million people, will require humanitarian assistance this year. Famine is occurring in hotspots in at least 5 locations in Sudan, with an estimated 1.3 million children under 5 living in these areas. Over 3 million children under 5 are at imminent risk of deadly disease outbreaks, including cholera, malaria, and dengue, due to the failing health system. 16.5 million school-aged children, nearly an entire generation, are out of school. This is not just a crisis, it's a polycrisis affecting every sector, from health and nutrition to water, education, and protection. UNICEF continues to receive alarming reports of grave violations against children trapped in this conflict, including their recruitment and use by armed groups. Between June and December 2024, more than 900 incidents of grave violations against children were reported, with a staggering 80% involving the killing and maiming of children, primarily in Darfur, Khartoum, and Al Jazeera states. Sadly, we know these numbers are just a fraction of the reality. In Sudan today, sexual violence is pervasive. It is used to humiliate, dominate, disperse, forcibly relocate, and terrify an entire population. Right now, an estimated 12.1 million women and girls, and increasingly men and boys, are at risk of sexual violence. This is an 80% increase from the previous year.
In Washington, D.C., dozens of teachers and students rallied outside the Department of Education to protest against Congress' proposed $1 billion budget cut for the Capitol. Footage shows protesters rallying with signs reading, "Fund schools, not billionaires," and "Kids deserve good schools." Demonstrators can also be heard chanting, "Pay for books and education, not for war and deportation." The demonstration comes after the House of Representatives narrowly passed a resolution that mandates a reduction of over $1 billion in D.C.'s budget to avoid a government shutdown. The funding will be the funding bill being reviewed by Congress would revert the district's funding to the 2024 fiscal levels over the course of 6 months, leaving teachers, students, and parents concerned over decreased funding for public schools.
You might not think that you want that, but when you lose it, you will miss it. New coalition to defend our services, and the service that does that. They might teach you about how Texas is the biggest state, even when it's not.
That they care about are going to have a job in 2 weeks.
Saeed Aziz, a University of Lagos student, has built an artificial intelligence text-to-speech model with a Nigerian accent named Yangprit. Aziz embarked on the building of Yarn GPT to help him improve his skills and chances of securing an AI role in future.
As Saeed Aziz walks into the Madhouse creative space with a friend in the University of Lagos, the quiet atmosphere contrasts with the big ideas that have come to life here. A final year student of the Mechanical Engineering Department with a deep passion for artificial intelligence, his journey into coding began in an unexpected place, on his phone during the lockdown. Like many young Nigerians, the pandemic was a period of self-discovery. While some found new hobbies, Saeed found code. Fast forward a few years, and Saeed has developed Yarn GPT, a text-to-speech AI model designed to sound unmistakably Nigerian.
tí wọ́n ti ń dá ara wọn lásìkò tí wọ́n ń bá nǹkan àwẹ̀ lọ́jọ́ àìkú gẹ́gẹ́ bí àlàyé tí alukoro ọlọ́pàá Bauchi Amegwa fi ṣe ní ilé-iṣẹ́ kan tó wà lójú ọ̀nà.
ChatGPT came about the fact that I saw someone build a text-to-speech model, but that text-to-speech model wasn't built for Nigerian support really. It was built for like general. It was built for like, let me say, European English, right? So I just saw that project and I thought of it would make sense if something like this can be done for like a Nigerian audience, since we don't have much support for that. Yes, so that was what came about YarnGPT.
YarnGPT takes written text and converts it into speech. But what makes it unique is its deep understanding of Nigerian accents. The base model originally supported only text tokens, so Said took things a step further by integrating audio components to make it truly authentic.
State's first female House of Assembly Speaker Mojisola Neranda resigned on Monday.
So the innovation I added to that model was that I added like some audio tokens to the model, because that model, the base model only had support for like text tokens. So I added audio tokens to the model, and I trained the model to understand those audio tokens that was given to it. So it wasn't trained from scratch, but if you look at it from the scope that the base model I used didn't have any support for audio, didn't understand audio, you can also say it was trained, like the audio parts was like trained from scratch. The most popular autoregressive model is ChatGPT. So the way it works, the way autoregressive model works is they predict one thing, they take that one thing they predict, put it back and predict another thing. So the way YarnGPT works is you give it words, and it predicts audio for that word. That's the way it works.
The development process wasn't easy. Said started working on the idea in November 2024, and by January the 1st, 2025, YarnGPT was complete. A 2-month sprint, including 3 weeks of rigorous model training. Python was its primary tool. But the real challenge was in the coding. It was majorly data and computing power. Gathering high-quality Nigerian speech data was no small feat. Said got materials from open-source platforms and movies, ensuring that the voice output was as close to real-life speech as possible. This is Said's first foray into building impactful tech. One of his earlier projects was Screenshotter, a Twitter bot designed to automatically take screenshots of tweets. It was simple but effective.
You could screenshot a tweet with your phone, right? But what this bot offers is that it makes the screenshot beautiful. Yeah, so it was a project I did in 2022 or 2023. I can't remember really. So basically, the way that project came about was I saw somebody build like a screenshot bot on Twitter. I just wanted to do my own. I checked out what the person had done. I couldn't see the source code of what he did, so I just went out in search of how to do my own. So basically, I coded like 90% of that on my phone back then, and I put the project out, and it was just like a project that I created for my room. I shared it to some of my friends to help me repost then, and suddenly that project started growing from zero followers. It currently has about 170,000 followers on Twitter. So that's like my most significant project, because this boy in the lab boy building something, and like the project was actually global at that point, because I see people actually use it, and I'm like, come on, I'm gonna build this,
The attention to detail is what sets YarnGPT apart, making it more relatable and usable for everyday Nigerians. And the best part, YarnGPT is now open source, meaning other developers can build on it, improve it, and adapt it for different needs. The potential applications for YarnGPT are vast, according to Said, from customer service chatbots that actually sound Nigerian to assistive technology that reads aloud for users. Said said he's already working on a read-aloud function to enhance the experience for local users. Said Aziz is a prime example of the innovation brewing within Nigeria's tech ecosystem.
In the meantime, Nigerian edtech startup Akọ̀wé is redefining the future of education and careers by making academic credentials secure, accessible and trustworthy. More importantly, the online platform helps educational institutions issue certificates digitally and securely using blockchain technology.
Meet Ayodeji Agbola, the founder of Akọ̀wé, an edtech startup servicing the education sector in a different way. In a world where academic fraud is on the rise, the Nigerian startup is rewriting the future of credential verification.
In Africa, the tertiary institutions still issue paper-based certificates, and therefore that has led to a problem around fake and forged credentials, academic records. And fake academic records exist because of economic pressures, the need for people to earn a living, and unfortunately there are no smart systems that people can use to verify the authenticity of academic records. And that's what Akọ̀wé is building. We're building an end-to-end smart system that anyone can use to verify the authenticity of academic records, as well as help institutions transition from manual paper-based certificates to digital certificates.
Using blockchain technology and artificial intelligence, Akọ̀wé is making certificate verification seamless in a record time of 5 minutes, a game changer for students, institutions, and employers.
The first is the certificate owner themselves. They spend a lot of time, energy, trying to get their transcript, trying to get their certificates as at today. Sometimes they pay monies, they don't get their certificates verified and stuff like that. There's also the fact that the employers want to make sure they don't hire fraudulent people. Today, that's a big problem. And finally, the tertiary institutions themselves. We know that universities, not just Nigerian universities, universities across the world, they move very slowly when it comes to innovation, but we are building tools and technologies that would help them transcend these bureaucracies and make sure that they can issue credentials digitally using blockchain, and also, be a part of the solution for helping customers verify their credentials, instantly.
But it doesn't stop there. Beyond verification, Akọ̀wé is integrating AI-powered data querying, allowing users to easily access and interact with academic records.
What we're using that AI to solve is 1, quick access to information, 2, verifiable data for HR firms, embassies, foreign universities, anyone who has the ability or need to actually verify academic records. They want this information, they want accurate information, and they want authentic information, and that's what we're building.
For students, it means faster, more secure access to their academic credentials. For employers, it ensures instant verification of qualifications. And for tertiary institutions, it offers a tamper-proof digital certification process, reducing certificate forgery.
The data on which the AI model is trained most times is foreign data. So that's why culturally over here, we lack, the ability to see solutions that are homegrown. But the solution is also very simple. We ourselves need to provide data to the AI models and train the AI models on our own data so that it knows exactly what you're trying to achieve, and it can be sort of culturally sensitive as well. So I don't think it's something insurmountable. Businesses just need to adopt the posture of, using AI and training it on our own data so that it can work for us.
But why AI? Akọ̀wé is building a homegrown solution, aggregating and training data over time to develop smart, locally relevant AI models, an approach that not only enhances verification, but positions Nigeria as a leader in edtech innovation.
We have been aggregating our own data. These are public academic records from public sources, and putting everything together on one single platform. And that's the data that we've been aggregating in the last 6 to 8 months. This data is about 300,000 records strong as of today. And we are constantly adding more records to it. And this is the data that we're using to train our AI models.
By combining AI and blockchain, the startup is changing the way credentials are issued, stored, and verified, setting a new standard for academic verification.
A mass iftar event holds in Syria for hundreds of orphans at the Al-Jalal basketball stadium in Damascus as Syrian Muslims observe Ramadan. Inside a sports hall, organizers arranged a banquet as rows of children sit at tables to break their fast. There are 1,000 orphans for this iftar, and the aim is to bring smiles to the children's faces amid the extremely difficult circumstances their country is going through. That's the world today for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Joke Rogers.